Was there an ulterior motive at play here? And what you're about to find out when we look at this science is that some things were measured and some things weren't. Some things were deliberately left out of the study, and it makes you just question things a little bit more. So right there, we got a couple red flags. Earlier this month, Stanford researcher Christopher Gardner released an 8-week randomized controlled trial in identical twins comparing a vegan diet and an omnivorous diet. And now this study sent shockwaves throughout our entire community, and many individuals believe that this was the final nail in the coffin, showing that a vegan diet is better than eating meat, and that eating meat is going to give you chronic diseases like heart disease, stroke, cancer, diabetes, and the list goes on and on. Now, if you haven't heard about this study yet, you more than likely will, because in just a few weeks' time, on January 1st, 2024, Netflix is actually releasing a documentary talking all about this study. It's called You Are What You Eat, a Twin Experiment. And so I want to break all this down today because there's a lot of nuances here. There's some things that weren't talked about in the study that are really going to surprise you, like who funded it, the background on the researchers, the science in general, what they left out, what they chose not to include. So when you're ready, let's dive in. Now, before I jump in and talk about this study and this documentary, I first want to take a step back and just come at this from an open-minded perspective, because when we see headlines like this, one against the other, vegan is better than carnivore or omnivore or vice versa, whatever our confirmation bias is, wherever our beliefs lie in that moment, we are more likely to take that side. Or if it opposes us, if we see a headline, if we are omnivore and we see a headline that says vegan is better, we're more likely to dismiss it. Or if we're vegan already or plant-based and we see a headline that says eating meat is health promoting, we're more than likely to dismiss it rather than looking open-mindedly at it. So coming into this, I really wanted to look open-mindedly at this and just get the background, check the science, and just kind of look at this from all angles to see what's really going on here. And I think that's what any good researcher and scientist has to do when they come into the data, because as you're about to find out, a lot that was going on in this study tended to be cherry-picked. And this is unfortunate because it's leading a lot of good-hearted people astray. Now, jumping into this study, like I mentioned earlier this month, Stanford University professor Christopher Gardner published his results of this 8-week randomized controlled trial on identical twins, showing that, quote, a healthy vegan diet led to improved cardiometabolic outcomes compared with a healthy omnivorous diet. Now, this is a randomized controlled trial. Randomized controlled trial can show cause and effect. This is different than observational or epidemiology-based studies. Randomized controlled trials eliminate essentially all variables but one. And then when there's an outcome, you can show that this one variable caused that, okay? And so that's why these are the gold standard of studies. And this was done on identical twins because they share the same genome. And if you give one diet, an omnivorous diet to one twin, and then you give a vegan diet to the other twin, that's like as gold standard as it gets. Now, Christopher Gardner also holds a few high-ranking positions here in the United States. Now, the first one being he is a director of the Stanford Plant-Based Diet Initiative, which is the PBDI, which was just launched a couple years ago in 2021. We're going to come back to that in 1 second. Now, he also sits on the U.S. Dietary Guidelines for Americans, which is the nutrition committee that is responsible for creating school lunches, prison nutrition guidelines, and things like that. He also holds a pretty unique position within that committee to lower or raise the saturated fat content. But not only that, he is also on the nutrition committee for the American Heart Association. So he holds a lot of high-ranking positions that can influence an entire culture on what they can and can't eat. Not to mention, he just released this study and he's coming out with a documentary, You Are What You Eat, on January 1st. Now, like I just mentioned, he is the director of the Stanford Plant-Based Diet Initiative, the PBDI. This was launched in 2021 with a 5-year grant by Beyond Meat. This is an ultra-processed food meat replacement company. So just take that in and let that sit there, put that in your back pocket. We're going to come back to that in a little bit. Now, the funding of the actual study itself, where did that come from? Because when we look at studies and we want to look at these objectively and unbiasedly, we have to look at who funded the study. Well, this particular study was funded by Kyle Vogt, and he is a member of the quote-unquote vegan mafia. So what is that? He is a part of a group of Silicon Valley investors who have historically invested in vegan-focused companies. Not only did he fund this study, but he also spent more than $1 million funding the Netflix vegan documentary, The Game Changers. So right there, we got a couple red flags. We got to take a step back and just put that in our back pocket and just sit on that for a second. Now, the more you look into this, it doesn't take long. You can watch the trailer of You Are What You Eat, the twin experiment, and it says from the producers of The Game Changers. Because as I mentioned earlier, Kyle Vogt has donated to many vegan films over the past several years, one of them being The Game Changers back in 2019. But he also gave a considerable donation of $600,000 to the Game Changers production company, Oceanic Preservation Society, or OPS. Now, they're on a mission to create media for environmental advocacy, like animal rights and stuff like that. Well, the OPS is also the same company that filmed this Stanford twin study. So they produced both the Game Changers and this study. And he's also donated to both of those. Now, taking this background information into consideration, these conflicts of interest weren't disclosed in the study itself. This should make anyone just take a step back and just look at this a little differently and ask the question, was there an ulterior motive at play here? And what you're about to find out when we look at this science is that some things were measured and some things weren't. Some things were deliberately left out of the study, and it makes you just question things a little bit more. Because now we're about to jump into the science, and you're about to see that some things were measured and some things were deliberately left out of the study because they didn't fit the narrative, which is a telltale sign of cherry picking. And this is what we want to avoid. So without further hesitation, let's jump into this study. Now, this randomized controlled trial, this lasted for 8 weeks, like I mentioned. This included 22 pairs of identical twins. So 44, you can do the math. 22 pairs of identical twins. They were either randomized to either healthy vegan diet or a healthy omnivore diet. And this is 1 twin per diet. Meals were provided for the first 4 weeks of the study. The participants were then asked to provide their own meals for the last 4 weeks. Now, in order to determine which diet was healthier, the researchers needed to test their lipid levels, their cholesterol, their LDL, their HDL, their fasting insulin, all those sort of metrics. And at the beginning of the study, this is important, at the beginning of the study, LDL-C was named as the study's primary outcome measure. Okay, so this is what they were testing for. And this was the sole variable upon which that they determined their conclusion that a vegan diet was healthier than an omnivorous diet. Because when they examined the levels of the vegans versus the omnivorous participants, LDL-C was indeed lower, 13.9 milligrams per deciliter on average lower in the vegans compared to the omnivorous group. But this shouldn't be surprising because all plant-based diets do indeed lower LDL-C in humans because some of the plant sterols within the plant compounds replace some of that cholesterol in the body. Now, this is a super important thing to take away. They also tested HDL and triglycerides among a few other variables. HDL was lower in the vegans compared to the omnivorous diet, and triglycerides was higher in the vegans compared to the omnivorous diet. Any diet that lowers HDL and increases triglycerides is not a healthy diet. Now, eating that omnivorous diet, that healthy omnivorous diet, void of ultra-processed foods, this increased HDL and this lowered triglycerides, but it didn't lower LDL the same as vegans. Now, if you just look at the LDL, mainstream would tell you that the vegan diet was healthier, but it's not taking into account all the other variables. And this is what matters most. Now, what was also mentioned in this study is that the vegans also had a better fasting insulin in spite of consuming more carbohydrates, which is a little interesting, but they also lost 4.2 more pounds on average than the omnivorous counterparts. And so this was part of the conclusion that a vegan diet is healthier. They lost more weight. Their LDL went down. Their fasting insulin went down. So overall, that should be healthier than the omnivorous diet. But there's some caveats to this. Now, they lost more weight because the vegan diet, they just ate less calories than the omnivorous diet. They ate 200 less calories, almost 200 less calories on average per day. Now, one thing that was not assessed was muscle mass. Did the vegan group lose muscle mass? Because if they lost weight, was that fat? Was that water? Was that muscle mass? Because any diet that causes you to lose muscle mass, just for the sake of losing weight, we don't want to lose weight and muscle mass. We want to lose body fat if we have fat to lose. If they lost muscle mass, which we don't know because they didn't test for it, that is not a healthy diet because muscle mass is a direct sign of longevity, just like HDL. Any diet that causes your HDL to go down, your triglycerides to go up, and you to lose muscle mass, which we don't know, guarantee that they probably did lose a little bit of muscle mass because they probably weren't eating bioavailable forms of protein. Because animal foods, meats, dairy, and eggs are high in bioavailable protein. You can look at what proteins are most bioavailable, which means most absorbable in the human body. This is the DIAZ score, the digestible indispensable amino acid score. And across the board, eggs, meats, dairy, they're all more absorbable, and your body can use more of that protein than you can from, say, peas and soy and grains and other plant-based sources of protein. They're just not as digestible. You don't absorb that protein. That's why across the board, usually most vegans, vegetarians, plant-based individuals just don't have a ton of muscle mass like a meat omnivorous diet, a meat eater would. And so we don't know if they lost muscle mass. That was not assessed. So we don't want them to lose muscle mass in this 8-week trial. We want HDL to go up and we want triglycerides to go down. Now, all they did was look at fasting insulin. They lost more weight, which was that muscle? We don't know. And they looked at LDL. Now, another reason that the vegan group might have eaten less is that on their subjective reports that they had to track down, they had to write how they were feeling and what they thought and things like that for 8 weeks, they reported less diet satisfaction. The omnivorous group liked their diet more. They said they enjoyed their diet more, whereas the vegans didn't enjoy their diet as much. Now, that could be a reason why they ate less and they lost more weight, and some of their metrics did improve. Now, that's also a red flag. If you're not enjoying your diet, then that's a sign that that probably isn't the diet for you, or the diet that's going to get you results long-term. That's not a healthy diet for you long-term. Now, here's one of the biggest red flags of this entire study. I just mentioned that they tested for fasting insulin and weight loss. Now, the vegan group experienced better fasting insulin and they lost more weight. Now, the problem with these two metrics is that the researchers did not list these as the original endpoints that they were testing for. LDL-C was what they were testing for. They were testing for LDL as the primary outcome measure. But fasting insulin and weight loss was not what they were testing for. And why is this important? Because when you start seeing these numbers and then you start reporting out on these, this is a direct sign of cherry picking. The reason that you have to report a primary outcome measure at the beginning of a study is to prevent cherry picking. The fact that they listed one, LDL-C, which they knew would go down because across the board, anytime you eat a plant-based diet, LDL does go down. They knew LDL was going to go down, so they tested for that. But they weren't entirely sure if weight loss would go down. They weren't sure if fasting insulin would go down, but they decided to report on it after the fact once they saw that it did work. So that's a sign of cherry picking. Now, to give researchers a little bit of props though, they did report that the vegan group ate 64% less vitamin B12 than the omnivorous group. Now, this is not good. We want more vitamins and minerals. And it's very well known that plant-based dieters, vegans, vegetarians, chronically and overall eat less vitamin B12, zinc, choline, carnosine, carnitine, heme iron, nutrients that are widely available in animal foods that you can really only find in animal foods or intentional synthetic supplementation. Now, in spite of all this, the Stanford Press released this study with a headline that says, "Twin research indicates that a vegan diet improves cardiovascular health." Hey guys, so as I'm editing this video, I realized that there's two things that I forgot to include that I really wanted to make sure I got in this video. These two things, I believe, really help to give you a more well-rounded perspective of understanding not only the study, but this documentary as well. And so what these are, the first thing is the LDL conversation. Now, LDL-C is the primary outcome metric that the researchers were using to determine whether a vegan diet was healthier than an omnivorous diet. You take LDL away from this study, and it has no legs whatsoever to stand on. Now, like I had previously mentioned, there was 22 sets of twins, and a majority of these twins were female. And what they were looking for was if their LDL-C would lower at the end of this study. And they knew it would because all plant-based diets lower LDL across the board. The problem with this is that LDL-C is not a significant risk factor for developing heart disease in women. Now, where's the science that shows this? Now, here's the thing. There's many different types of LDL. There's small, dense particles, there's VLDL, there's LP(a). There's so many different types of LDL molecules. This stands for low density lipoprotein. This is a cholesterol carrier. So it's not directly cholesterol itself, but it carries cholesterol to and from the body. And LDL is what's known as your bad cholesterol, quote unquote, bad cholesterol. But there's different types of LDL. Some are good, and LDL in and of itself is a strong antioxidant. So we can't just blanket statement and say LDL is problematic. Now, LDL-C is what's believed to be causal or associated with heart disease, and conventional health experts want to lower this. So if LDL-C was the major cause of atherosclerosis and cardiovascular disease, people with the highest LDL-C, you would think, should have shorter lives than people with low values, right? Well, in a recent systematic review of 19 cohort studies with more than 68,000, this fills up an entire football stadium, more than 68,000 elderly people of aged 60 or older, the researchers found that the opposite was true. That the higher the LDL-C, the longer they lived. Because like I just mentioned, LDL is an antioxidant molecule and it has other functions within the body that's beneficial. If that's not enough, in the largest cohort study ever conducted, those with the highest LDL-C levels lived even longer than those on statin treatment. But the media won't tell you that. The media will definitely not tell you that high LDL levels caused longer lives than taking a drug. Now, to put the final nail in the coffin, in addition to those two studies, there have been numerous studies in Japanese women that have found that high LDL-C is not a significant risk factor for coronary heart disease mortality in women of any age. And for the men in this study, was LDL-C a problem to begin with? It's definitely not a problem for the women according to the science, But what does the science have to say for the men in this study? In a large American study, including more than 140,000 patients, that's 2 football fields. That's 2 stadiums. 140,000 patients with acute myocardial infarction, their LDL-C at the time of admission to the hospital was actually lower than normal. It was lower than normal levels. Yet they were still admitted with acute myocardial infarction. In another study with the same finding, the authors decided to lower the patient's LDL-C even more. It was already below normal, but yet they decided to continue to lower it even more. But at a follow-up 3 years later, total mortality among those with LDL-C below 105 milligrams a deciliter was twice as high compared to those with a higher LDL-C. And that's even after adjusting for confounding variables. So they were able to isolate this one component. So what this means is the more the doctors lowered LDL-C levels in these patients, in the 140,000 patients, the more they lowered it, the more the risk of death went up. They saw more death from their patients. But yet people are still going to see this headline. People are still going to watch this documentary and believe that the vegan diet was healthier than the omnivorous diet. So let's take a step back and look at this. The researchers made their conclusion that a vegan diet was healthier than an omnivorous diet based pretty much solely on that one metric, LDL. And it's not even a significant risk factor for the women in this study to begin with. Yet they still concluded this study by saying, quote, the healthy vegan diet led to improved cardiometabolic outcomes compared with a healthy omnivorous diet. Clinicians can consider this dietary approach as a healthy alternative for their patients. Even though lowering their LDL is meaningless, they also lower their HDL, which is not good, which we know is a significant metric that we want to have high, and they raise triglycerides, which we want to lower. Now that brings me to the second point that I wanted to mention, and that's at the conclusion of this study. The researchers then asked all the twins, all 44 of the twins, will you continue to follow the diet that you're on? 21 of the 22 vegans said no, they will not continue to follow this diet by choice because their diet satisfactory score was low. They did not like the diet they were eating. Only one of them said they might continue to eat the diet. When you include animal products as a part of your diet, unprocessed red meat, eggs, unprocessed dairy like raw dairy, cheeses, kefirs, and yogurts, and things of that nature. When you're eating these animal foods as a part of a whole food diet, and you're not eating ultra-processed foods that were really just invented within the past 100 years, donuts, pizzas, and you're not eating your animal products with these foods, because typically the meat is eaten on a pizza as pepperoni. And this is what researchers call red meat. They call these things red meat, and this is how they classify that red meat is problematic, because it's eaten as pepperoni, it's eaten as sausage on pizza, it's eaten as hot dogs, and things like that. But this is not what a healthy omnivorous diet is. And if LDL-C goes up when you're eating a healthy omnivorous diet as a part of a whole food diet, the science shows that that is not problematic. And why would it be? We've been eating these foods for as long as humans have existed. And we've never had heart disease at epidemic proportions like we've had until the past 100 years when we started including modern day lifestyle factors like smoking, drinking excessively, high stress, low sedentary behavior, and ultra processed foods. But when you start including these foods into your diet, you see rates of cancer, heart disease, diabetes, they skyrocket. So my message to you is, do not be fooled by these headlines. Don't be fooled by films, by documentaries that have an underlying agenda. Now, I tried to come into this conversation unbiasedly and looking at all angles of this research. But what I kept coming back to were these things that were hidden, these red flags that just weren't mentioned in the study, and these metrics that were cherry-picked, and LDL-C that doesn't even matter in terms of lowering or raising it in the long term. Because this study only ran for 8 weeks, and you cannot paint a long-term health picture based off of 8 weeks. All they got was that they lowered fasting insulin, they lost a little bit more weight, they lowered their LDL-C a little bit more, but we've already talked about that. And so I appreciate you guys for being here. Now, as I wrap up, I hope I was able to present to you a more well-rounded approach to this study. And if you're going to go out there and watch the documentary, You Are What You Eat, on January 1st, I hope you have a better view of what went into it, who funded it, what they maybe left out of the study, what they chose to include in the study, and things like that. So I hope I could present to you more well-rounded information, because there's a lot that went untold in this. And if we are just scrolling on social media or we are on Google and we see a headline that says a vegan diet is better than an omnivorous diet, and if our beliefs align with that, then we are more likely to believe that, or vice versa. And so I just wanted you to be more well equipped so you knew what went into this. Now, if you found this video helpful, I would love it if you could share this out with somebody who you know needs it most. And if you feel compelled, comment in the comment section below what your favorite takeaway was. Subscribe, give me a follow on Instagram. I'm at Craig_McCloskey. I appreciate you so much, and I'll talk with you soon.